Not too much further. Up the mountain.
Blending old and new together under one title is one thing that seems hard to get right in today's film industry. If the slew of horror remakes we've seen over the last decade are anything to go by, nostalgia is mostly used as a cash grab. But what if nostalgic elements were used as a building block, and not the foundation? In 1980, Stanley Kubrick released his adaptation of Stephen King's arguably most popular work, The Shining. At the time, The Shining was terribly received by critics and audiences, even going as far as earning Kubrick a Razzie nomination for Worst Director. Yeah, the director of 2001, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, Spartacus and Eyes Wide Shut was once seen as one of the worst directors working. But after around 7 years, The Shining started getting reappraised by some critics. The process was slow, but by 2001, the film had started to receive some of the enormous praise that it sees today. It got Channel 4's Scariest Moment for the infamous Here's Johnny scene, Total Film ranked it as the 5th greatest horror film of all time, and then in 2006, Roger Ebert, arguably the best and most influential film critic of all time, inducted the film into his Great Movie series after initially being one of many who were extremely critical of The Shining when it first hit screens. Despite all of its critical and commercial ups and downs, The Shining is an undeniable masterwork. Script, performances, cinematography and soundtrack are all up to Kubrick's monumental and brilliant standards. The Shining has inspired thousands of people, myself included, and in 2013, another man inspired by Kubrick released their first feature. When Mike Flanagan released Oculus in 2013, many praised his focus on characters and building an atmosphere rather than filling a couple of hours with jump scares and calling it a day, which is an issue that plagues the horror genre today. His work attracted the attention of some big names, including Quentin Tarantino and horror author Stephen King, who coincidentally released Dr. Sleep in 2013 as well. Flanagan would further hone his craft in later outings like Hush and Before I Wake, and he would release his best work yet in the form of The Haunting of Hill House, a horror series released to Netflix in 2018. Another great work from Flanagan, showcasing people's battles with past trauma and addiction in a horror setting. Once again, Stephen King saw Flanagan's work and praised it, saying, "I don't usually care for revisionism, but this is great, close to a work of genius," and he's not wrong. And then, in 2019, the pair would finally collaborate, with Flanagan being named the director for the film adaptation of King's follow-up novel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep. Now, Dr. Sleep was going to be a tough one to make because there's two audiences you have to take into account: fans of the original Kubrick film and fans of more conventional horror. Kubrick's style of filmmaking isn't for everyone. It can feel slow and drawn out, and then Flanagan's style doesn't allow for this, as his involves pretty intense and constant character development and atmosphere building without a bigger focus on the technical side. Many had doubts that Flanagan could pull it off, but he did, and he did it magnificently. In a genre as convoluted as horror is today, it's hard to get noticed, and even when you do, with a great film, consumers of the genre have a very short memory and tend to forget some of these films when they become a few years old. So when a film that's 40 years old is still praised as the magnum opus of the genre, you know it's special. But why is it so special? It's safe to say that it's in large part to the director's name. Kubrick is one of the most influential directors ever to stand behind a camera, and all of his films are remembered and known by most thanks to just how unique and precise his style was. The Shining is no different, and Kubrick's techniques and feel are all over it. Earlier we talked about the criticism that The Shining received upon release, and we can read all the reviews, but it's important to see the root of these reviews. The Shining was cast aside simply because it wasn't conventional. Its focus wasn't on grossing you out with over-the-top gore, or scaring you behind the sofa with a jump scare like most things releasing at the time were. No, The Shining is an atmospheric psychological horror that uses slow pace, picture-perfect shots, eerie imagery and strange encounters to get into the audience's head. At the time, this wasn't how people were scared. Audiences had been conditioned to be scared by visually horrific things, which is why The Shining may come off as boring to some, because it isn't what they expect when they sit down to a horror film. When most people think of The Shining, the first thing they think of is Jack Nicholson, and for good reason. He gives his career best performance here, and is only pushed higher by his co-stars. He and Shelley Duvall bounce off each other, with Jack using Shelley's sometimes over-the-top acting style as a foundation for some of his lines. But his best scenes, and some of the best in the film, come when he shares the bar with Lloyd, the Overlook Hotel's bartender. There's something about these scenes that is truly captivating. The line delivery combined with the gradual shift into a more sinister conversation is just brilliant, and the same thing can be said for Jack's conversations with Grady in the bathroom, but these talks get a lot more evil and a lot less subtle than the ones he has with Lloyd. See, I could talk about The Shining for hours on end, and a lot of that comes from the ending. The slow zoom into a picture from the 1921 4th of July ball, which ends with the realisation that Jack, the man we've been following throughout the whole film, is in that photo. The open nature of this ending is what makes it work. There's no big red circle around Jack saying, "Look, look, here he is." It just shows it to you and then fades away, leaving you wondering what it could all mean. And I wouldn't change it for the world. To put it simply, Dr. Sleep is a perfect blend of new and old. It uses the nostalgia of The Shining to push itself to a height that a lot of horror films simply cannot reach. While we talk about these heights, it's not above using some shock value, which comes in the form of Baseball Boy. Now, shock value when not earned, to put it bluntly, is shit. Look, here's something horrific for the sake of grossing you out. But Dr. Sleep justifies and earns the right to show the True Knot's vile act with a lot of setup prior. We know that they target children and likely kill them thanks to the opening scene, and before the Baseball Boy killing actually takes place, we learn that pain purifies the steam. Now, the steam is what extends the True Knot's life, and they can only get it from people who can shine. So then that begs the question, what do you do to them to purify the steam? And by this point we know the True Knot is dangerous, so you might not even want to learn what they do to these kids. But the film shows it to you anyway, and it is shocking. It shows you them cut up this boy in mid-shots. It's not hiding anything. You watch him die, surrounded by all these people with glowing eyes screaming and gasping over him. And that's the thing. It's the build-up, which both Dr. Sleep and The Shining have an elevated understanding of. We were saying before about how Flanagan's style of filmmaking is less focused on the technicality with more of a focus on characters, and Flanagan offers some of his best character development yet, only preceded by The Haunting of Hill House. Danny Torrance in The Shining is great. But here we have a character with so many layers that it's hard not to be invested by the end of his first scene. The Shining served as the foundation for Danny's story, and Flanagan builds brilliantly on it. The grey area in Danny's life between The Shining and Dr. Sleep is left mostly untouched in terms of us being shown what happened, aside from some scenes that take place almost immediately after the events at the Overlook. But there are a few things we see in the film that can give us an idea of what happened between the two stories. Dick Halloran, the Overlook Chef from The Shining makes a few appearances in Dr. Sleep as well. One crucial thing that we learn is that he has taught Danny to lock the ghosts of the Overlook in boxes in his mind, so that they stop coming for him. At one point before the film's finale, we see a small glimpse into Danny's mind, and in there we see the Overlook maze filled with countless boxes that all contain one of the Overlook ghosts. If this tells us anything, it's that the most of Danny's life has been spent looking over his shoulder, waiting for the ghosts to come for him, and it eventually pushed him into alcoholism, and he did most of it without his mother, as we learn she died not long after the events of The Shining. All this is a prime example of incredible character development and attention to detail, which even Kubrick would be proud of. Talking about characters, Rose the Hat. Jesus Christ, what an antagonist and what a performance from Rebecca Ferguson. Rose the Hat and the cult she leads, the True Knot, are immediately cemented as a threat in the first few minutes, where she and her group assumedly capture and kill a small girl. The scene itself is great, with no music being used and just the rustling of the leaves playing while this girl becomes more and more terrified and more endangered. Most of the True Knot scenes do follow this formula, with Flanagan letting the group's aura do all the talking. Rose, while not developing much as a character, has a pretty solid arc as well. By the end of the film, everyone she cares about is dead, so all she cares about is retribution, and what she lacks in development, she does make up for in brilliant lines and even better delivery from Ferguson.
Yes, you run, dear. And then I will find you, and you will scream for years until you die.
When you're watching Dr. Sleep, in the back of your mind you know that eventually we're going to be heading to the Overlook Hotel. One big worry was that this film would be using Kubrick's masterpiece as a crutch, but it doesn't. The entire Overlook sequence is sheer perfection, and it couldn't afford to be anything less. This is the crucial part where Dr. Sleep has to use the atmosphere and the characters it's built, mix in some of The Shining, and then round off Danny Torrance's story that has been 40 years in the making. Despite all of the pressure, Flanagan and his team pull it off. Shots from Kubrick's film are recreated down to the T, and at the same time Flanagan uses the infamous hotel for some great shots of his own. Alongside many old ghosts of the hotel, the bartender Lloyd makes a return, only this time he looks a bit different. Danny's conversation with his father feels like his goodbye. He is making peace with his past and his future because at this point he knows what he has to do. The Shining and Dr. Sleep complement each other perfectly. The Shining eventually got the praise it always deserved, and Dr. Sleep pushed Flanagan's reputation to where it always deserved to be. While both of these films did fail commercially, hopefully one day everyone will see these two films for what they really are, the perfect duology.